One must grant this much to the rabble that stormed the United States Capitol on January 6, 2021. They at least had the candor to carry their Confederate flags openly through the halls, rather than leaving them furled in the metaphorical closets where the Republican Party had been storing them for decades. There is something almost refreshing about fascism that drops its mask, that ceases to speak in code about states' rights and law and order, and simply screams what it means, blood and soil, or in this case, blood and stolen elections. I happened to be rereading Gibbon on the morning of the 6th, call it a premonition if you like, and was struck by his description of how the Visigoths entered Rome. Not as conquerors, but as claimants, convinced they were restoring something rather than destroying it. The parallels were almost too neat when, hours later, I watched a man in a Camp Auschwitz sweatshirt wandering through the rotunda, looking for all the world like he expected to find his birthright hidden behind one of the paintings. But let us not dignify this mob with classical comparisons they wouldn't understand. These weren't Goths or Vandals. They were the peculiar American variety of authoritarian, the ones who believe they're fighting tyranny while attempting to install a tyrant, who scream about freedom while trying to overturn an election, who invoke Christ while bearing weapons into a temple of democracy. It's a special kind of cognitive dissonance that requires years of careful cultivation by Fox News and talk radio, a hothouse flower of unreason that blooms only in the specific soil of American paranoia. What struck me most forcefully, watching the scenes unfold, was the explicitly religious character of the mob. There were the evangelical prayers in the Senate chamber, the woman claiming God had sent them, the shofar blown in the rotunda, that particularly offensive appropriation of Jewish tradition by Christian nationalists. Here was American fascism finally admitting what it had always been, a fundamentally theocratic movement, one that sees democracy not as a system to be perfected but as an obstacle to the implementation of God's will, as interpreted by Donald Trump. One saw them praying over their zip ties and tactical gear, blessing their bear spray and baseball bats. It was like watching the Crusaders if they had been recruited from a strip mall in Alabama and armed with merchandise from a police surplus store. The QAnon shaman, with his horns and furs, provided an almost too perfect symbol of this synthesis. Part Viking berserker, part New Age mystic, part American fascist, united in the person of a failed actor from Arizona whose mother probably still did his laundry. The presence of the Jesus Saves banner next to the gallows erected for Mike Pence tells you everything you need to know about American Christianity's final transformation into something that would have appalled not only Christ, that Jewish socialist who counseled turning the other cheek, but even the more martial church fathers. Augustine at least had the honesty to develop a theory of just war. These people wanted to hang the vice president for the sin of following the Constitution. We are told ad nauseum that we must understand the economic anxiety of Trump's base, that we must appreciate their feelings of displacement, that we must not call them what they are. Very well, let me understand them. They are the inheritors of the Confederacy, pursuing by other means what their ancestors failed to achieve by arms, the overthrow of multiracial democracy in America. The Confederate flag that was paraded through the Capitol had never made it that far during the actual Civil War. Even Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia had been stopped from achieving what a real estate developer's personality cult managed on a Wednesday afternoon. This is what Trump meant by "Make America Great Again," the restoration of a white supremacist order that briefly trembled when a black man was elected president and shook again when another election rejected its avatar. One must be precise about this. The mob didn't storm the Capitol because they believed the election was stolen. They stormed it because they believed elections that they lose must be by definition illegitimate. This is the logic of Jim Crow, of the redemption period, of every attempt to restrict the franchise when it threatens to produce the wrong result. The only thing new was the openness of the attempt. But we must not let ourselves be distracted by the carnival of the mob from the more serious villainy of those who unleashed it. Trump, of course, bears the primary responsibility. This third-rate Mussolini who couldn't even organize a proper putsch, who inspired a coup attempt and then went home to watch it on television like it was an episode of his own reality show. But Trump is merely a symptom, not the disease. The disease lives in Josh Hawley's raised fist, in Ted Cruz's cynical objections, in the entire Republican establishment that spent 4 years genuflecting before a man they knew to be a danger to the Republic. These are the truly contemptible figures, the ones who knew better, who had read the Constitution, who understood exactly what they were doing when they spread lies about election fraud to fundraise and appease a base they had spent decades radicalizing. Watching senators who had spent the morning fomenting insurrection spend the evening condemning it reminded me of Talleyrand's observation about the Bourbons. They had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. Even after the mob they had summoned came for them, they couldn't quite bring themselves to fully repudiate it. One noticed how many of them condemned violence on all sides, as if there were another side that day, as if Antifa had been hiding behind the statuary. What followed the attack was perhaps more dispiriting than the attack itself. The immediate attempt to memory hole it, to minimize it, to engage in what Orwell called the euphemism, question-begging, and sheer cloudy vagueness that English, or in this case American, political language employs to defend the indefensible. It wasn't an insurrection, it was a protest that got out of hand. They weren't terrorists, they were concerned citizens. Trump hadn't incited them, he had merely used unfortunate rhetoric. One watched the same figures who had spent the summer of 2020 demanding that every broken window in Portland be treated as the second coming of the weathermen suddenly discover nuance when the windows being broken were in the Capitol. The same voices that had called for the deployment of the military against Black Lives Matter protesters managed to find sympathy for white insurrectionists who killed police officers. The arrests that followed were almost comically lenient. People who had live-streamed themselves committing federal crimes were allowed to go home to await trial. The woman who had stolen Nancy Pelosi's laptop to allegedly sell it to Russian intelligence was released to her mother's custody. One couldn't help but imagine the response if it had been Black Panthers or American Muslims who had stormed the Capitol. The body count would have been in the dozens before they reached the steps. Even as I write this, the attempt to transform January 6th into something else, a patriots' protest, a Fedsurrection, a false flag operation, proceeds apace. This is how fascism has always operated in America. It commits its crimes in broad daylight and then denies they happened, or if they happened, that they were crimes, or if they were crimes, that they matter. The Republican Party now asks us to move on, to heal, to stop being divisive by remembering what happened. This is rather like an arsonist asking you to stop dwelling on the past while the building is still smoldering. They want reconciliation without truth, forgiveness without repentance, unity without accountability. It's the same offer the South made after the Civil War, and we can see how well that worked out. Anyone who thinks January 6th was the end rather than the beginning is engaged in wishful thinking of the most dangerous kind. The conditions that produced it, the right-wing media ecosystem, the white supremacist movement, the Republican Party's transformation into an authoritarian cult, have not been addressed. If anything, they have metastasized. The next attempt will be more competent. It will be organized by people who learned from January 6th's failures. They will have better lawyers, better preparation, better coverage from their media allies. They will use the language of democracy to destroy democracy, the rhetoric of freedom to impose tyranny, the symbols of patriotism to commit treason. The mistake would be to treat January 6th as an aberration rather than a revelation. It showed us exactly what the American right has become. A movement that would rather end democracy than share it, that would rather rule over ruins than live as equals in a republic. The Confederate flag in the Capitol was not an anomaly, but an admission. This is what it was always about. What was attacked on January 6th was not just a building or even a government, but an idea. The Enlightenment notion that human beings can govern themselves through reason rather than force, that power derives from the consent of the governed rather than the will of God or the accident of birth. This idea, always fragile and never perfectly realized, is what the mob came to destroy, whether they knew it or not. Madison, Jefferson, and the other founders, for all their hypocrisies and contradictions, built something remarkable in that capital. A secular temple to the proposition that arguments should be settled by debate rather than violence, that power should be transferred by ballots rather than bullets, that no one, not even the president, not even if he believes God is on his side, stands above the law. The proper response to January 6th is not healing or moving on, but a renewed commitment to these principles. It requires calling fascism by its name, confronting white supremacy directly, and refusing to tolerate the intolerant. It means understanding that democracy's enemies don't always come wearing foreign uniforms. Sometimes they come wrapped in the flag and carrying the cross, or in this case, carrying the flag and wearing the cross. We stand now at one of those hinges of history that occur perhaps once in a generation. We can choose to pretend that January 6th was a fluke, a bit of political theater that got out of hand, and hope it doesn't happen again. Or we can recognize it for what it was, a declaration of war against American democracy by forces that have always existed in this country, but have rarely been so bold or so close to success. The optimist in me, and yes, there is one, evidence to the contrary notwithstanding, notes that they failed. The certification proceeded, the transfer of power occurred, the republic survived. But survival is not victory, and democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires citizens, not subjects, participants, not observers, people willing to defend it against those who would destroy it in the name of saving it. The image that stays with me from that day is not the shaman in the Senate or the Confederate flag in the rotunda, but something simpler, the custodial staff, cleaning up the debris afterward, doing their jobs, restoring order. There was something profoundly moving about these workers, many of them black and brown, cleaning up the mess left by white supremacists, just as their ancestors had been doing for centuries. They reminded me that democracy is not maintained by grand gestures, but by ordinary people doing extraordinary things, showing up, doing the work, refusing to let the barbarians win. The question now is whether the rest of us have their courage and their clarity. The barbarians didn't win on January 6th, but they didn't exactly lose either. They'll be back, better organized and better funded, unless we stop them. And by we, I mean anyone who still believes that reason is better than force, that democracy is better than authoritarianism, that the Enlightenment project, flawed and incomplete as it is worth defending against those who would drag us back to the dark. The shining city on the hill turned out to have a mob at its gates, and they were already inside. What happens next depends on whether we're willing to admit it and act accordingly. History will not forgive us if we fail.